For the long trend 2026 report, TIJ is proud to continue our long-standing partnership with PRI and as a co-publisher of this flagship annual report since 2017. And the Global Recent Trends report has provided data-driven analysis of key development challenges and emerging issues that face prison system worldwide. Over the past year, it has become an invaluable resource for policymaker, practitioner, researcher, and those who work towards a safer and humane criminal justice system. This year's editions mark the 12th publications in the series, and it has been produced with the support of Ilanut, our dear friends, for the second consecutive year. And we warmly welcome and greatly appreciate Ilanut's partnership in this important collaboration. While we will hear more about the highlight from the report from Jerome, I would like to briefly highlight why this publication is particularly important and valuable for the prison reform agenda. For practitioners working in a closed setting, learning from developments and innovation in other jurisdictions is essential. It's helped them broaden perspective and encourage new way of thinking. At TIJ in Thailand, we translate these publications in Thai, and we use the insight and example from this report and integrate that into the capacity building program that we deliver for the department's operations in Thailand and some other countries in Southeast Asia. So in this way, we see this report serve as not only as a sort of information, but also a practical tool for professional development and update that you could learn around the world every year. And more broadly, the report provides a global snapshot of prison system and emerging trends, and it's offered evidence to support informed policy making at both national and international level. Its contribution to discussions at the forums such as CCPCJ and the upcoming 15th Crime Congress would help ensure that prison reform will remain firmly on the international agenda and grounded in human rights. So once again, I would like to thank Penal Reform International for its leadership in developing and guiding these publications. For this one is the 12th report that they've been publishing, and as well as all the individuals contributors to these publications, as well as a co-sponsor of this side event. I look forward to hear from our distinguished speaker today. Thank you.
And thank you particularly for the comments on the practical effect and impact of the report. I think it's really important to keep in mind. So thank you very much for that. Before I hand on to the next presenter, I just remind presenters we are sort of limited in our time today, so remain within your time alone. Greatly appreciated. So having said that, I'll just hand over to Jerome Magdalene, the Global Policy Manager of Penal Reform International. Thank you.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, colleagues, and friends. So I would like to start my intervention by saying that prisons do not exist in isolation, in a vacuum. They reflect the strength of the rule of law, the quality of governance, and wider social, economic, and political conditions, as reflected in the various sections of this year's Global Prison Trends. So when the rule of law is weakened, consequences are often most visible behind prison walls. People may be detained unnecessarily, held for excessive periods of time, or imprisoned for political reasons, while oversight and access to justice become increasingly limited. At a time when conflict, instability, and democratic backsliding are affecting many parts of the world, prison systems are facing mounting pressure. Reduced resources, growing prison populations, and deteriorating conditions place an even greater burden on those people who are in prison. Now, this report provides a snapshot of these developments and trends in the prison reform agenda. So more than 11.7 million people are imprisoned worldwide on any given day. Yet the wider impact goes far beyond those figures, affecting prison staff, families, communities. And you'll see when you read the report that it reminds us that prisons are not a marginal issue, but a central component of justice systems and an important measure of a society's commitment to human rights and human dignity. So as you can see here on the slide and on the infographic, globally the prison population has increased by approximately 27% since the 2000s. While men continue to constitute the overwhelming majority of people in prison, the number of women in prison continues to rise in many regions at a faster pace than the male prison population, around 60% since the year 2000. So regional trends you see vary considerably. In Africa and Oceania, growth has been driven largely by risen levels of pretrial detention. In many African countries, people awaiting trial now account for more than 40% of the prison population. Across the Americas, prison populations have expanded dramatically, fueled by punitive criminal justice policies, particularly in relation to drug offenses. South America's prison population has more than tripled since the year 2000. Asia has also experienced substantial growth, driven by the developments in several regions and highly populated areas, where more than 500,000 people are currently imprisoned and around 2/3 are awaiting trial. Although Europe is the only region to record an overall decline since the 2000s, prison growth remains a concern across much of the continent once Russian figures are excluded from the data. Moving on, overcrowding, which is also one of the main issues covered throughout the report. Overcrowding remains one of the most persistent and damaging challenges facing prison systems worldwide. So more than 100 countries around the world operate with prisons at occupancy levels exceeding 110%. So the consequences are severe. Overcrowded prisons frequently struggle to provide adequate healthcare, sanitation, nutrition, and safety. So access to education, rehabilitation, purposeful activities are often limited or entirely absent across the board. So the impact falls disproportionately on vulnerable groups within the prison system, including women, children, people with disabilities, and people with dependence to drugs. So in many cases, overcrowded conditions reach levels that may be considered inhuman or degrading under international standards. So reducing overcrowding goes far beyond the notion of increasing prison capacity. It demands policies that also address the drivers of imprisonment, particularly the criminalization of poverty-driven and status-related offenses, excessive pretrial detention, and the overuse of custodial sentences overall. Now, in the next slide, I would like to focus here on the last point, which is one of the drivers of prison overcrowding, which relates to extreme sentences. So the global movement towards abolition of the global movement towards the abolition of the death penalty continues to make progress. So today, the majority of states have either abolished capital punishment or no longer carry executions. However, among the countries that retain the death penalty, executions increased significantly during 2024 and 2025. So particularly sharp rises were recorded in 3 retentionist countries. So drug-related offenses remain a major driver of executions, despite long-standing concerns that drug-related offenses do not meet the threshold of the most serious crimes under international law. So alongside these developments around the death penalty, the use of life imprisonment continues to expand, with around 500,000 500,000 people under life sentences. So concerns persist regarding life without parole and other irreducible sentences that remove any realistic prospect of release. So research consistently demonstrates the harmful effects of such sentences, including psychological distress, loss of hope, family separation, and the accelerated aging of prison populations. So the challenges for policymakers is therefore not only to abolish the death penalty, but also to ensure that everything that will replace the death penalty has to comply with international human rights standards. So I would like you to also check our latest publication, The Alternatives to the Death Penalty Information Pack, which is also available on the Homes International's website. I know I'm running out of time. Okay, so encouragingly, you will see in the report there is a section called Reducing Prison Populations. You'll see that many countries are pursuing strategies to reduce prison populations. So around the world, we have 11.7 million people in prison. We do have 12.5 million people who are subject to non-custodial sanctions, to alternatives to imprisonment. We're talking about probation, community service, community-based measures. So you will see in the report that some reforms are underway across Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Latin America, Europe, and governments are increasingly recognizing that well-designed alternatives, human rights compliant alternatives to imprisonment can actually reduce reoffending while avoiding the human and financial cost of imprisonment. So we would also like to be cautious regarding the alternatives. So the report shows that in some jurisdictions, the alternatives have expanded without reducing imprisonment, creating a phenomenon that we know as net widening. And so net widening is simply a phenomenon whereby more people become subject to criminal justice control and supervision. The report also highlights gender responsive, gender transformative approaches to alternatives. So I would like to invite you to read the section on reducing prison populations, because you will have an insight into the latest trends in seeking responses in the alternatives. Moving on, we have a spotlight on the rule of law this year, which is one of the new sections that we wanted to highlight, because the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index provides a useful tool for assessing how effectively countries uphold principles such as accountability, fundamental rights, due process, and the fair administration of justice. So according to recent data, most countries experienced a decline in rule of law performance over the past year, and prisons provide a powerful lens through which rule of law trends can be analyzed. So jurisdictions that perform strongly on measures such as accountability, fairness, due process, generally rely less on imprisonment and invest more heavily in rehabilitation and community-based sanctions. By contrast, weak justice systems are often associated with excessive imprisonment, overcrowding, and corruption, where prisons fail to support rehabilitation, reintegration, public confidence in justice institutions is weakened, and respect for the rule of law is undermined. So I would like to invite you as well to read the spotlight on the rule of law. And then finally, regarding our report, as you will see, the cover of our Global Prison Trends report is a prison gate in Ukraine. We thought it was also a good way to have or acknowledge the state of affairs globally and the rising trend in armed conflicts and how armed conflicts and violence expand across many regions with a disproportionate impact on the prison systems. And we have to acknowledge that usually in humanitarian responses, prison systems are heavily overlooked and remain unaddressed. So our report offers examples of civil society organizations, monitoring bodies, prison administrations that continue to work under extremely difficult conditions in conflict-affected areas to protect the rights of people in prison, maintain access to justice, and improve detention conditions. Finally, we would like to also acknowledge, and that is being mainstreamed throughout the report, our efforts from civil society into prison reform. This year and last year, we have launched a global alliance of civil society on prison reform. We have more than 80 members who form part of this alliance across all regions of the world, working towards one goal: knowledge sharing and advocacy agenda around a more humane, fair, effective criminal justice system, especially when it comes to prisons. And I would like to say that the Global Alliance of Civil Society on Prison Reform has been key and essential into providing insights into the Global Prison Trends Report this year. Finally, this is another nudge to Penal Reform International. I'm doing some publicity here, but next Tuesday we will launch a new report on prison work, a guide to regulated and rehabilitative-based approaches. The report is informed by lived experience. We had people with lived experience feedback into the process, from the design up to the research process and the review of the guide. So make sure you don't miss our launch next Tuesday. And thank you very much for giving me the time. I think that was completely good.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it was really sobering to be able to hear what the latest statistics are, particularly concerning an area that may not be very well in the public consciousness. And so I was particularly interested to hear about the work that engaging civil society actors are trying to not only to broaden understanding, but to find solutions to the complex issues that are positive and proactive. And I think it's a really valuable one. Having said that, of course, we will move to our next speaker. Laura Ospina, who's the Senior Program Officer, Justice for All, Pathfinders for Peaceful, Inclusive and Just Societies. Thank you.
Hey everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And thank you to Penal Reform International and TIJ for this wonderful report. It really was an inspiration for what I'm about to show you all here today. I'm after watching, the whole global scape of everything that's happening in penal in prison systems. I will now focus specifically on the Ibero-American region. So I'll zoom into this. And by Ibero-America, I mean all Latin American countries together with Spain, Portugal, and Andorra. Okay, so this study was developed by the Ibero-American Alliance on Access to Justice, which Pathfinders is a member of. And this is a thematic annex of on women in prisons that is part of the 2026 Women's on Access to Justice report in Ibero-America. So it's a wider report, but we did a thematic annex specifically on women in prisons. And this study was produced jointly by, of course, all the members of the Alliance. But I would give a great shout out to IDEF, which is the Ibero-American Association of Public Defenders, as well as Ilatnud, who's here with us today, and the World Justice Project, and the PACT 2.0, which is a Spain-EU cooperation program in Latin America. And this draws specifically, of course, on administrative data, but also on prison visits and institutional monitoring reports, and of course, the voices of women themselves. The study draws on two complementary sources of evidence. So one is a broader regional evidence based drawing on national preventive mechanism reports, as well as public defender monitoring data and institutional analysis from various countries in the region. And then secondly is a survey that we implemented in 4 countries to 219 women. Then the surveys were administered by public defenders during public prison visits, giving us direct access to women's voices. And this methodology was intentionally designed to surface what administrative records sometimes tend to miss, which is the trajectories or barriers and accumulated experiences of women who have unfortunately been failed by justice systems long before they entered the courtroom. So the central argument of the study is that prison is not a starting point, it is an endpoint of a chain of broken access to justice links. And if you look at the pathway that we've put up here, first, these are structural conditions that the state has often failed to address. And from there, women sometimes come in contact with, for example, illegal economies, frequently not by choice, but by necessity or coercion. And then they are arrested without gender-informed legal defense, and they are held then in pretrial detention as a default response, as Jerome mentioned, pretrial detention in Latin America is quite high. And then they enter prison with, their families ruptured. And as you can see below each box, at every stage of the chain, the system fails to intervene adequately. I don't know if everybody can see, that's very small, but the data from our survey makes quite vivid, what I'm trying to explain in this path. 62% of women in our sample are imprisoned for non-violent offenses. 62 reported prior experiences of violence that were never addressed by the protective systems, and 59% have had family members in prison. So, creating this intergenerational cycle of criminalization. And 77% are mothers, many of whom were their children's primary caregivers in detention, which Jerome also highlighted. So let me turn now to the regional picture of magnitude and trends. Jerome did also mention, how in Latin America, incarceration rates are unfortunately for women very high and growing. And these figures are driven in large part by drug-related offenses. In some countries, for example, like Panama, over 70% of incarcerated women are held for drug crimes, mostly low-level transport or storage. And pretrial detention is, of course, a major driver, as I mentioned. In Bolivia, for example, a large proportion of women are held without final conviction, sometimes for months or years. And if you compare this data to the Iberian Peninsula, each show a much lower rate reflecting different policy choices around alternatives to detention or drug law enforcement and the use of pretrial measures, showing that the high rates of female imprisonment are not inevitable. They are the product of choices that can be changed. And one more concern is that women are statistically a minority in the prison system, which reduces political pressure for reform. So their invisibility in the data perpetuates the invisibility in policy. And Jerome mentioned that as well. As you can see, in the report, 93% of men versus 7% of women are incarcerated worldwide. So who are the women being imprisoned and why? So from our report, 3 structural factors stood out. First, the overwhelming majority of women in prison come from contexts of multidimensional poverty. The criminal justice system consistently fails to distinguish between crime and survival. Second, drug laws are applied without hierarchical distinction, meaning that women who play the lowest level roles in criminal economies receive the same or similar sentences as those higher up in chains. So coercion and partner dependence are rarely assessed when sentencing. And third, unfortunately, police, prosecutors, and judges many times apply gendered moral judgments. So a woman who does not conform to idealized maternal roles may be treated more harshly, and her prior history of violence is rarely considered in criminal proceedings. And the key insight in this is that criminal justice systems intervene late. So after social protection systems have already failed these women, then that's when the criminal justice system intervenes, and intervenes very harshly. So what does a better system look like? The study identifies 3 interlocking pillars for reform, grounded in a shift from a punitive system to a more people-centered justice. And the first pillar is early legal aid. Gender-responsive legal defense must begin at the first contact with the system and not at the trial. So, for example, IDEF and Copolad, which is another cooperation agency, have developed specific protocols for women charged with minor drug offenses. And evidence from Guatemala shows identifying prior violence as a care responsibility, and care responsibilities early in the process changes outcomes completely. The second pillar is alternatives to detention. So, the Bangkok rules, we all know them, they're clear. Pre-trial detention must be the exception and not the rule. And several countries in the region, Jerome mentioned this as well, and worldwide this is a tendency, but in Latin America, some of the countries have already started moving in this direction. So Brazil, for example, with a law in 2018 now allows women, pregnant women, and mothers of young children to serve sentences under house arrest. And Colombia, Costa Rica, Spain, Mexico have all developed similar frameworks of non-custodial options for women. And the third pillar is gender-sensitive prison management. So, like, for example, for pregnant women in detention and providing gender-sensitive tools for reintegration. So programs like the Fazendo Justicia in Brazil, Aurora in Peru, Reinserta in Mexico show what is possible, but unfortunately they still remain exceptions rather than the norm. And here, let me close with 5 concrete recommendations or key messages that come out of our report. First, as I mentioned, early legal aid must be a priority. Legal defense with gender perspective from the earliest contact with the system is an obligation. Second, pretrial detention cannot remain the default response for non-violent offenses. States must build an individualized assessment before ordering detention. Third, alternatives to detention must be real, accessible, and gender designed. And fourth, reducing women's imprisonment is a political decision that reflects the democratic quality of the justice system. Jerome said this quite well, and the World Justice System has mentioned. We do not measure justice system by how many people it imprisons. We should measure it by whether its responses are proportionate, rights compatible, and effective. And fifth, reintegration and post-prison support are inseparable from a just penal response. Women released without tools, networks, or economic opportunities face high risks of reincarceration, and the state's obligation does not end at the prison gate. So the wider report has already been published in our website, and the thematic report should be published in both English and Spanish in the coming weeks, and we will keep you posted. Thank you so much.
Thank you indeed. Again, very sobering to hear about another even more marginalised and neglected population within the prison systems that do not get a look in. And I think it shows also the intersection in rights terms of the long way we still have to go in terms of empowerment of women, representation of women in decision-making capacities as well as in policy-making, because they're still very, very much dominated by men. They're still very neglectful of a lot of issues that are related to women. So thank you very much, particularly on the recommendations. Our next speaker, Rebecca Marquez Rocha, is that correct? Yes. Okay. Yes. From the Youth Rise is now going to address us around children and youth impacted by criminal justice systems. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Rebecca. I'm a researcher and doctoral candidate here at the Central European University here in Vienna. I come from Brazil. Today, I'll be presenting on behalf of the colleagues from Youth Rise. But I would like to start by saying that I don't think I'm going to paint a nicer picture. I think, sadly, I'm going to be talking about yet another demographics that are harshly impacted by criminal justice systems and that are suffering all of the harms that are connected to those. But I had prepared a whole presentation, but for the sake of time, I'm going to stick to only a few of the points here. But I would like to start that I really like that we talk about the children and young people in the criminal justice system, because I think it really forces us to reflect on what is the purpose of these systems and what is really the goals that these systems are trying to achieve. Can we really talk about future generation without promoting rehabilitation and reintegration? So today I'll be presenting some of the points that come from consultations that we developed as a project that was led by the Global Commission on Drug Policy, and we did this in collaboration also with the Global Campus for Human Rights. And I was a part of this project as well, and we conducted consultations around the world with experts, including young people and children, to identify the direct and indirect impacts that drug control approaches can have on youth. And this project will have a policy brief resulting from which will be released in this summer. So some of you may know that the UN in Vienna houses another commission beyond the CCPCJ, which is the Commission on Narcotics Drugs. The reason why I'm saying this is because, well, crime control and drug control often intersect. And as any policy, they oftentimes have unintended consequences, which is also something that was already discussed by UNODC itself. And these consequences may have some impacts, also long-term impacts on a young person's life. I'm saying this because back in 2016, the special session of the United Nations General Assembly on the world drug problem pledged to promote and achieve a better tomorrow for the world's youth. So 10 years after that, have we achieved this better world? And to which extent are the policies that we are applying for crime control and drug control contributing to achieving this tomorrow? So are we really protecting the youth? I'm saying this because zero tolerance policies that are often framed as protective measures can also have some impacts and contribute to the insecurity that young people are facing in their lives. See, for example, the Latin America and the Caribbean region. It is the region of the world with the highest homicide rates. And the latest UNODC data tells us that these numbers are driven by organized crime, illicit drug markets, and the military and police actions that are aimed at combating crime. And in this picture, children and young people, they become both victims and targets of these crime control interventions. So we see that more than 45% of homicide victims in the Americas are aged between 15 and 29 years old. And this is also the same age group that represents more than 26% of suspects that are brought into the criminal justice system for intentional homicide. So in both cases, we see that young boys are the ones bearing the biggest burden. So what does protection really mean here in this really complex picture, and whose rights these protective interventions guarantee? This is a picture from what became known as the Penha massacre from Rio de Janeiro. This is where I come from. It was last year in Brazil, and it's the result of a police operation that left 121 people dead. 1 in 3 out of those killed people was a young person aged 25 or below, and 2 were children aged 14 and 17. So this is not an isolated case. And policies that are framed as protective, they can feed a vicious cycle that will expose children to violence, punitive enforcement, restricted health and social services, disrupted education, and, well, lifelong stigma. So I'll go into some of the results of the project. And what we identified is that these protective measures, they can have direct and indirect harms in a young person's life. For the sake of time, I'm going to focus on the direct impacts because I want to focus on the system acting on a child or a young person directly, and the children and young people that are involved in the criminal justice system. What we see is that some parts that are usually underprivileged communities, low-income communities, they are often over-policed, which also results in racialized interventions that are targeting specifically minorities and racialized communities. That also subject these young people to what we call adultification, which is understanding that these young people whenever they are in contact with crime or whenever they are placed in a certain part of the city that is considered to be more prone to crime, they are judged responsible for their actions. So we completely disregard the social determinants behind the actions in which those young people were involved. That means that they are often subject to strip searches and bodily intrusion that has lifelong impacts, contributes to anxiety, low score levels at school, and overall trauma to a young person's life. But I think that we need to think of what is the impact that this has also on this period of time in a young person's life, and the sense of identity that will be formed in this young person. By you adopting these policies, you're really delimiting the possibilities for this young person and the opportunities that the young person see for themselves in terms of development, in terms of what they can achieve. And in a way, you're pushing them to engage more and more with these criminal pathways. Criminal records, whenever they are in contact with the criminal justice system, these criminal records can have lifelong impacts. They can exclude them from work opportunities. They can exclude them from school. They cannot finish the school pathways. They can exclude them from social services such as housing, for example. So you're just consolidating more and more the open opportunities that they will have in their lives. And then, as I said, feeding into that vicious cycle that will push young people further and further into the criminal pathways. And we also saw that sometimes things that should be treated as public health issues, such as drug dependence, are actually being treated as crimes. So in many cases, we see that supportive harm reduction prevention services are not really available to people below 18 years old. But in some cases, these people can be held criminally responsible from 7 years onwards. So they are being punished before they can be even supported. So how do we ensure that the policies and the legal frameworks that we have are not pushing these young people even further into these criminal pathways? So I won't be going too much into detail, but I think that we saw in the other presentations here that we have UNICEF estimated in 2024 that around 250,000 of children aged between 5 and 17 years old were detained worldwide for alleged or convicted offenses. We saw in the presentation of Laura how there are also indirect effects due to family members and mothers that are imprisoned, and what is the effect that this have on a young person's life. And we saw this in the consultations as well. We saw a lot of people that participated in the consultation mentioned that whenever you have a family member that is arrested, sometimes the burden to be the breadwinner for that family falls into a young person. And that means that the young person needs to find solutions to have an income, and that may push them further and further into criminal pathways. And this is a hard conversation to have, you know. What do we do? Criminal justice systems, we usually see people as either victims or perpetrators. And what do you do about the young person that is both a victim, is being exploited by criminal organizations? Nevertheless, they are involved in these activities, and sometimes they are the ones that are also recruiting young people to become more involved in these criminal organizations. So how do we respond to that? And I think it's a really important question to make. But most and foremost, we need to remember that these kids and young people are victims. They are being exploited. And even though it's a complex pathway, they are primarily victims. So we need to keep this in sight whenever we are developing policies to respond to the issue. I'm not going to go into detail, as I said, but I think that this complexity demands policies that can respond to the root causes that are associated to young people getting engaged with these criminal organizations. But nevertheless, what we see is this raise in the demands for decreasing the minimum age of criminal responsibility internationally. And here you can see some of the criminal ages that we currently have. But only this year, we saw that Argentina, for example, decreased the minimum age of criminal responsibility from 16 to 14. And we saw also in Sweden plans to advance to lower it from 15 to 13 for serious offenses, despite opposition. We are really risking doing the opposite of what we would like to promote. So we are risking pushing even younger children deeper into criminal systems and closer to the networks that we would like to protect them from. Criminal organizations are recruiting minors, and if we lower the age of criminal responsibility, they will start recruiting even younger people. And how do we ensure that this won't happen, and how do you fix it once this has happened? The evidence tells us that lowering the minimum age of criminal responsibility does not really yield a lot of positive results. We saw in Denmark when they lowered the age of criminal responsibility from 15 to 14, those children became more likely to reoffend, less likely to finish school, and scored lower on exit exams. And this is all what is called the labeling effect. So the system is not protecting them, it's rather marking them forever. And as I said, limiting the opportunities available for their future. So what do we do? And I think that this is the $1 million question. So I just wanted to highlight some of the things here. And I apologize, I had prepared another slide, but it didn't appear. Now I had a situation with the presentation, but I wanted to highlight the Global Declaration on Advancing Child-Centered Justice, which was adopted last year in Madrid in June. And I think it really gives us some hints of what we could be doing. But I think that the ethos is placing children at the core of justice systems and involving them meaningfully in the design of these responses. One of the programs that I wanted to highlight, and I know that I brought a picture from Brazil, but last year in Brazil, I think we are starting to advance some interesting policy innovations that I think could inspire some of you here today. In Brazil, we have the program, the strategy Growing in Peace. It was implemented last year. It received also the support from UNDP and UNODC. And it's a strategy that focuses on 3 pillars, which is preventing crime from happening. So preventing violence that comes from crime, preventing the exposure of these children and young people to criminal organizations, but also to the violence that comes from the policies that we use to curb these criminal organizations. Then we focus on supporting them and providing them rehabilitation, and providing them opportunities and addressing the root causes to reintegrate them in societies. And then finally, you invest. You invest in the things that will be able to contribute to long-term maintenance of keeping these young people away from criminal organizations. So invest in community-based approaches, invest in school, invest in health, and divert money from the ostensive criminal control responses that are indeed just causing further harm in these young people's lives. And one thing that I think that it's really important that comes from the report that is presented here today is count. We really need disaggregated data on age, ethnicity, and gender of the children and young people that remain invisible, which is the children and young people in the criminal justice system. How can we respond to issues if we don't see the full picture? So invisible, no data means invisible children. And here I would urge that we start adopting more measures so we can actually have reliable data that allows us to see the full picture. And finally, listen to the young people, particularly the young people with lived experience. And I mean here, young people with drugs, young people that have had encountered encounters with criminal justice systems, and also young people that were involved in criminal organizations and gang and drug trafficking. We need to listen to them to understand what is an effective way that we can respond and offer alternatives to these young peoples and their career paths. So I'm really sorry for taking so much time. I hope that this message came across, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity, and happy to continue the conversation after the event.
I think you really highlighted some very interesting points, particularly around the need to really shed light on what is happening and what is going on. I mean, one of the countries that have just announced they're going to reduce the criminal age responsibility, Sweden, had said it's in response to the fact that children are being recruited into criminal gangs and committing crimes, and it's a protective measure. And you look at them and think, well, instead of doing the hard work, looking at what the root causes are and what would actually enhance the protection of children, they're relying again, our policymakers, on the knee-jerk reaction to say that the criminal justice system can be a tool to address society's ills. Obviously, it cannot. So thank you for highlighting that very important points. I'd now like to pass over to Duane Entojado, who is a lecturer in criminology and sociology at the Adelaide University and member of Penal Reform International's Global Group of Experts by Experience.
Thanks very much, Francesco, and hello, distinguished colleagues, delegates, friends, and partners. Congratulations for my colleague at the PRI TIJ for launching the 12th publication on global prison trends. Now, this report matters because it gives us a clear view of the state of imprisonment across the world. It shows us the pressures that prison systems face, the reforms being attempted, and the human consequences of penal policies. But as we read through these trends, we must also ask a deeper question. Whose knowledge is being used to understand prison? Whose knowledge is still being left outside the room? For too long, prison reform has been discussed primarily by governments, institutions, professionals, academics, and international organizations. Of course, these perspectives are important, but they are incomplete when they do not meaningfully include the voices of people with lived experience of criminalization and imprisonment. Lived experience is not simply a personal testimony. It is not just a story to make a panel more moving or a report more human. Lived experience is knowledge. It is expertise produced through direct contact with systems of power, confinement, exclusion, survival, and sometimes transformation. When we meaningfully include lived experience, we improve the quality of the reform. People who have been incarcerated often understand the everyday operations of prisons in ways that policy documents cannot fully capture. As someone with lived experience of incarceration, we understand what overcrowding feels like in the body. We understand how isolation changes a person's sense of time.
We understand the difference between a rehabilitation program that exists on paper and one that actually reaches people. We understand how prison rules, staff cultures, family separation, stigma, poverty, and trauma shape the real possibilities of change. This is why lived experience must be built into penal reform as a matter of principle, not as an afterthought. It should inform research, policy design, program development, prison oversight, staff training, reintegration planning, and international standard setting such as this commission is trying to do.
It should be paid, supported, protected, and taken seriously. Inclusion cannot mean inviting someone to speak for 5 minutes and then returning to business as usual. It must mean sharing power, changing methods, and recognizing that people who have been subjected to criminal justice systems have a legitimate role in reshaping them. Equally, this work must begin with the language we use. Person-centered language is not a matter of politeness or semantics alone. It is a matter of dignity and power. When we describe people as offenders, inmates, prisoners, or criminals, we risk reducing whole human beings to a legal status, a conviction, or a moment in their life. Person-centered language reminds us that people in prison are also parents, children, students, community members, survivors, and people capable of change. It does not deny accountability, but it refuses to let punishment become the totalizing identity through which a person is known. If penal reform is to be truly humane and evidence-informed, then our language must reflect the humanity, complexity, and future of the people at its center. This is particularly important in the global context. Across jurisdictions, we continue to see overcrowding, racial and social inequality, the imprisonment of people with mental health needs, the overuse of pretrial detention, and the marginalization of women and children, indigenous peoples, foreign nationals, and people living in poverty. These are not only administrative or legal problems. They are lived realities. They are experienced in cells, in visiting rooms, in courtrooms, in families, and in communities long after release. If we are serious about humane, person-centered, and evidence-informed reform, then lived experience must be part of that evidence base. It helps us see what institutions often obscure It challenges
The distance between policy and consequence. It reminds us that prison is not an abstract side of correction, but a social world that profoundly shapes human beings. As we launch Global Prison Trends, I hope we treat this not only as a report on what is happening, but as an invitation to rethink how we know what is happening. The future of prison reform must be people-centered, rights-based, and grounded in the knowledge of those most affected. Nothing about prison or punishment should be developed without the meaningful participation and leadership
of people who have lived through it. Nothing about us without us. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I actually find it very important, given that in the modern political discourse we're seeing across the globe these days, it's very easy for that political discourse to demonize, marginalize, dehumanize, and take basically dignity away from people. And I think it is really essential that anybody who has a mind in terms of trying to influence public policy needs to take a stand on these things and needs to reassert them really boldly as to what we believe in those values that are behind them, so that we don't just allow the ground to be taken by people who will utilize tools like language to demonize and marginalize and to have terrible impacts, not just in terms of discrimination and exclusion, but also physical risk to people. So I think it's a really important point that you made. We were going to have a Q&A, but I think we're running out of time. We might actually have to leave the room. So I'm really sorry about that. It would have been a very stimulating conversation, I think, given that the number of people online and who are present, and given the various issues that have been touched on. But at this point, I think I will pass to Douglas Duran Chavarria, the Director of the United Nations Latin American Institute for the Prevention of Crime and Treatment of Offenders. And I just also like to note that Illinois, for the second year in a row, has provided financial and research support for this report, which everyone's recording. So thank you.
Thank you. Excellencies, colleagues, friends, I want to thank the Penal Reform International, the Thailand Institute of Justice, and all the speakers who have contributed to this conversation today. It is an honor for ILANUD to support this publication by PRI and PIJ, as you said, for the second consecutive year, and to do so as a committed strategic partner. That collaboration reflects a conviction that a regional institution like ours, with over 50 years of work in criminal justice and penitentiary systems across Latin America and the Caribbean, has a particular responsibility to provide technical assistance to the states in our region in meeting their obligations under the international human rights framework, and to name the gaps that make reform stall. The data in this report tell a clear story about our region. The prison population in Latin America and the Caribbean has grown 161% since 2000. Pretrial detention in the Americas has risen 59% in the same period. And the number of women deprived of their liberty in our region has increased by 186% since 2000, the highest increase recorded globally. These are not abstract trends. They describe systems that are processing people at scale, most of them, as Mrs. Spina mentioned, Laura, people very poor, the vast majority of them charged non-violent offenses, and without evidence that doing so makes a community safer. The evidence actually runs on the other direction. Global Prison Trends documents that research found that recidivism among participants in community-based programs was a fraction of the national average in some countries. That evidence exists. The question is whether it reaches decision makers who need it. And here is the structural problem. In much of our region, it does not. ILANUD's Prison Population Information Bank covers 14 countries, And what that data set reveals is not just what is happening in our prisons. It is what we still cannot see. Disaggregated data, as you mentioned, on the most vulnerable populations in detention is largely absent. Alternative sanctions are applied to less than 1% of sentenced persons across 14 countries, yet almost no jurisdiction systematically tracks their outcomes. When data is absent, decisions get made anyway based on political pressure, public fear, or ideological preference rather than ethics. Colleagues, the quality of our decisions in criminal justice is bounded by the quality of our data and sharp analysis of it. Opacity preserves the status quo. Transparency strengthens our democracies and builds a more robust rule of law. And that's why this new global prison trends is very important. And that's why Ilanut is happy and proud to be part of it once again. Thanks again to PRI, to TIJ, and thanks to you all.
I'd like to hand the floor now to Mr. Jan Hofstad, the Policy Director of the Ministry of Justice and Public Security in Oslo, we're very fortunate to have with us here tonight. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesco. I'll be very quick. I did not look forward at all to reading this year's report because I'd read them before, and I know it's bleak reading. It's sobering, as you mentioned, Francesco. I'm very glad that you at least have a certain amount of opportunities, positive developments, possible routes for change in the report. Otherwise, it would be really, really horrible. Situation is not good at all. We have to go forward, grounded in human rights standards. I come from a country, Norway, which has traditionally had human rights standards, high quality prisons, and so on. This does not come by itself. For many years, had regular visits from the Council of Europe Committee for the Prevention of Torture, Inhuman and Degrading Treatment and Punishment. These visits have been eye-openers for us, shown us that what we thought was a reasonably good systems was not up to the standards that are developing all the time, and have promoted a lot of change. You mentioned the language drain. I was 15 years a police prosecutor. During those 15 years, tremendous change in the way we talk about the people who are arrested, who are put in prison, and so on. Of course, also influencing the way they are treated throughout the system. Language matters. Thank you for pointing out that. Our good neighbors in Sweden and Denmark have been mentioned here today in connection with the age of criminal responsibility. We struggle now. We are challenged with children, and also in our country, children being recruited as killers and committing tremendous crimes. What to do with that? It's a great challenge for our criminal system, and it's been, on the one hand, sobering also to see the quick way that our politicians will grab aggressive rhetoric against children, and on the other hand, developing quite advanced systems for avoiding prison for children. But it's a great challenge for all our countries. We're really into uncertain waters for us. We also have seen the way we don't really think about the end results of some changes in our legislation. Penalties for sexual crimes have grown tremendous in Norway. That has been a political agreement, but maybe it's been a bit over the top. Our prisons are now filled with elderly men, disrupting the possibility for good rehabilitation programs and so on. Nobody really thought about this when we all were very concerned about raising the punishments. So things are connected. We are all challenged, and this report brings us again forward in providing opportunities and also painting this very bleak picture and making it certain that things have to be done quickly. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to particularly thank once again all the presenters who've come here today to present different aspects of the issues that we've been looking at, and to also thank the groups and entities that are all engaged in the production of this report. I think it's a really important one. I think it's something that can be really used as a practical tool, as I mentioned at the beginning, as a way of taking dialogue forward, of debating the issues, of opening up what the issues are, and trying to have proper discourse, not only with policymakers and decision makers, but also, you know, the wider public. We know that fear is a great handle that politicians will sometimes often seize on to make themselves feel important or powerful, to reinforce their positions. And unfortunately, issues around crime particularly fuel into that, and they fuel into the primal fears that everybody has, whether they're real or not, whether they're rooted in fact or not. And often politicians will take the easy way out, which is to resort to criminal justice system, as I said, as a tool to address society's ills, when in fact, that is not the answer at all. And it's really a cop-out, because it just means that they're using that rather than address the real tough issues that have to be looked at as to what's causing these things in the first place. So I really hope that this report will go some way to that. And I really hope also, wish you all the best, and thank you again for having me here today to be able to moderate the session. And I encourage you all to read the report in depth and to see what you can take from it practically. So thank you. Thank you, everybody.